Tansi. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to present at this conference, and special thanks to the people whose land this is, the Flathead Nation, and also thanks to Bronwyn for inviting me here. I'll introduce myself through my nation, but before I do that, I have to give some of my lineage. And let's see. In order to do that, we have to go way back. And so one of the things that I was really excited to see when I arrived in Australia was that we could see some of the same constellations. And particularly this time of year, this constellation is visible. And in English, it's the Orion constellation. In Cree, it's our constellation called Wisagijak. And Wisagijak is a central energy or character within our mythology, but also our who we are as people. So Wisagijak is a creative force or energy that keeps creating. So our creation is ongoing. One of the reasons why I'm linking back to this is because in our Cree cosmology, this is our ancestry. So all of us have energy in us, obviously, that came from billions of years ago. And Wisagijak, interestingly enough, if you break the name down, it means a wandering star or a sour star. So Wisagijak is our trickster character, and many lessons are learned or stories are told specifically around gender diversity, but also around sexuality. And one of the things that I've noticed as an educator is that looking at kids' books especially, there's a resurgence of Indigenous stories and now in literature, right, especially in children's books. And I was looking at all the Wisagijak books that are out there, and all of them have recharacterized Wisagijak as a male figure. And so we have our traditional stories, which have now been recalibrated, as you said, but into a heteropatriarchal language and system in English, and then translated back into Cree, which is kind of ironic, but there's a number of ways that this has happened and other examples as well. But I wanted to start by this because this is kind of the core of who we are as Cree people. So this is our origin story, and we don't have any conflict between Western science and our origin story, because basically they tell the same story, and that is how we came to be as people. So the Cree and Ojibwe story is very similar, and basically it's probably not the right time to tell this today because, well, we don't have enough time for one, but also it just wouldn't be appropriate here in your country and your land. But just to give a kind of synopsis of it, it starts with energy in the universe, and then the earth is created, and then single-celled organisms come about, eventually multiple-celled organisms, and then down the road plant, animal, and then finally billions and billions of years later human life. And so that's all captured in this beautiful painting by Daphne Ojig. And you can see that there's some important kind of figures in this painting. And one is the character that's putting mud on the back of the turtle, and that is Wisagijak. So again, that central character is part of who we are, our creation story, and our creation story never ends, it's still going. So by showing this and by telling the story of Wisagijak is a way of kind of undoing the master European narrative that has been imposed on us through Christianity and through other colonial forces. So we have a natural law, or many natural laws in Cree and in, as other Indigenous nations do as well. But everything kind of pivots on this one law that we have in our language. And if you go back to Wisagijak and that term, in the middle of the term is the word for love. So our creation, our origin, our ongoing creation all has to do with showing love in our actions. So this is a natural law, and there are consequences if this is not followed. So there are natural consequences, there are physical consequences, and there's consequences on a spiritual realm. I think I'll kind of skip forward past this. So this is where I'm from, the Opaskwayak Cree Nation. If you have GPS, it's at 101 degrees west and 54 degrees north. You're all welcome to come to visit. And that's where I grew up, and that's where my family is from. And you can see it's in the middle of the country we call Canada, and along the Saskatchewan River Delta. So the Saskatchewan River Delta is one of the largest freshwater systems, delta systems in the world, and it's also one of the most endangered. You can also see on the side here is Lake Winnipeg. Lake Winnipeg is the 10th largest freshwater lake on the planet, and it's the #1 endangered right now. So in Canada right now, you can see that water rights and environmental issues are really important. And for us as Cree people and Indigenous people, our existence has always been obviously linked to the land. Our survival has been linked to the land, and our thrivance has been linked to the land as well. So people kind of jokingly call Opaskwayak Cree Nation the gay Indian capital because there's so many of us. And a study came out a couple of years ago, I would say kind of a bogus study, but one of the things that they found was that they said because the water is polluted, it's producing more queer people down there. So we have Edmonton, Medicine Hat, Saskatoon, and Lethbridge to thank for our fabulous queerness in our Opaskwayak Cree Nation. But just, growing up there, the way that I grew up was that, like most people, you're in your family community, you play outside, and you learn about the land through your relationship to your community, your relationship to your family, and your relationship with the land and the water. And so when I grew up that way, there was never any kind of a gender imposition on myself. And as I got older and started to go to school, I realized that there was a completely different world out there that I hadn't been raised knowing. And one of the first times I can recall thinking about this or realizing this is in one of our community dances. So powwow is not a traditional thing, it's kind of a recent thing. But before that, we did have ceremonial and community dances. And in one of our community dances, people would gather around and dance in the community hall or outside, depending on the season. And one of our community dances, I remember dancing along, and one of my little friends said to me, "Quit dancing like a boy." And I thought, quit dancing like a boy, what does that even mean? Because I was just being myself, right? So I kind of looked at the elders, and they just kind of shook their heads, and they said, just be yourself. So it was at that point I realized that there was some kind of a force or some kind of a thing happening that makes other people think they can regulate your body, right? So this was a form of regulation, a form of disciplining, or whatever kind of. And at the same time, I also realized that there were traditions that go a lot deeper or that are a lot older than this regulation that is currently happening. As I got older in high school, because Canada is a very hockey-friendly country, and when my brothers and I got up for school in the morning, often we would go out and play hockey if we could on the ice before school bus came. So hockey was just a really big part of our lives in the winters, obviously. at school it was time to have skating, and I brought my hockey skates to school, and the phys ed teacher told me I couldn't wear hockey skates. And she said, "You can't wear hockey skates because people will think you're a dyke." So at that point, I also started to realize that this regulation wasn't just around gender, it was also linked to sexual orientation. So there's interconnecting things that happen. So I wasn't able to skate that day, but it also made me realize again that coming from a Cree community, that there was always this kind of thing happening where this where outside influences were impacting us in a way that continually marginalized the same groups of people, and that was women and queer people. As I got older, I left and went to school, and I went to do my undergrad at Cal State Sacramento, and at that time was 1993, the World Indigenous Peoples Conference in Education was happening here in Wollongong. So I submitted a paper, and it got accepted, and when the conference materials came out, lo and behold, all of my stuff wasn't in there. So I don't know, were any of you at that conference? One day. Okay. And so I thought, well, my First Nation had already given me money to come, so I was being sponsored, so I thought I would come here anyway. And so I came, and there was a few of us that kind of got together, and we said, well, why don't we just have our own kind of gathering, and we'll meet by the side of the hill by the cafeteria, and I'm not sure where that is now, that way somewhere. But very quickly, delegates were told if they went to this gathering, they'd be asked to leave the conference. So here's a kind of another marginalizing but also silencing at the same time, which to me is on the spectrum of violence, right? So I did what any other good little dyke would do, and I just went to the beach instead. But when I was at the beach, falling around in the waves, there was a man standing on the sand, and he was kind of laughing because obviously I wasn't used to these big waves. And when I came out, I went to talk to him, and to me, he looked like a Native American elder from, Canada or the US, and sure enough, he was. His name was Jerry Brown. He was from the Flathead Nation of Montana. And I started talking to him, and he said, well, what do you think of the conference? And I told him what had happened, and he said, oh, gee, that just doesn't sound right. He goes, well, just come and hang out with me, and everything will be okay. So we came back to the conference here, and that night they had an open mic, and you were allowed to go up and say something if you wanted to. So there was many Maori people singing, and other people performing, and other people just saying what they needed to say. So we got in line, and just as we got to the front of the line, they said, well, that's it for tonight. We're done. So I thought, okay, this just isn't going to happen because all of these barriers keep getting put in place. So the elder Jerry said, just don't worry about it. Things will work out. So I didn't end up going to the sessions at the conference, but he did ask me to come to the closing ceremony. The closing ceremony was at one of the stadiums. Do you know the name of the stadium?
It's the big theatre just after they built it. The theatre field.
It's outside stadium. Anyway, it's a huge place. It seats thousands of people, and
that's right, it was the old one.
so it was quite a spectacle because people were wearing their ceremonial garb, and there was dances, and it was kind of a celebratory feeling. And one of the things that happens at these conferences at the end is that they announce who is going to host the next conference. And obviously it's a financial boom to the community that gets it, but more importantly, it's a way to showcase and also honor the traditional territory and knowledge from your own community. So it is a big honor to host one of these. And so when it came time to hand over the the sacred items, they announced that the next country that would be the host of the conference would be the United States. And so they said, can we have the representative from the United States come up? And nobody kind of moved, and everyone was looking around. And then finally Jerry got up and walked his way very, very slowly up to the front stage. And he graciously accepted the bundle for the US to host the next conference. And then after that, he told a story. And the story that he told was about a character that is essential to the existence of the Flathead people. And that character is the Winkte. And so in today's kind of language in English, we would characterize that person as two-spirited or a gay male. And so he talked about that and the importance of that. And so people were really happy that he did that. And I in particular was very overwhelmed because I learned a number of lessons that week. One is that to be patient, and two is that don't just be patient, you have to actually do something with that patience. And I also realized that our knowledge systems are, they're not just a few hundred years old. We have lived continuously on our land for tens of thousands of years. So we have an intimate understanding and connection that not all people on the planet have. And with that intimate understanding and connection comes an understanding around sexual diversity and gender diversity. So on the very highest spiritual level in Cree, there is no gender. So that's why I began with the Wisagi-Jack constellation. So if you break down our language on that level, there is no such thing as gender. So gender is a cultural construct. We've created it as humans, and it changes all the time. And as you showed in the museums, and others have showed, in their documentation of histories in their own nations, there's been an imposition of a gender binary that has been not just significant, but destructive for groups of people. And it's always the same groups of people. And I mean, this is really important that this conference is happening. And I would say that 20 years ago, well, some of you weren't born yet, but for those of us that were, I don't think we could have ever imagined this. So it is really significant. So thank you for that. So the Cree language is gendered, but it's gendered based on animacy and inanimacy. So whether something has a spiritual purpose or not, that is the primary view of cosmology, that spiritual understanding. And so that's how the term two-spirit came about. It doesn't literally mean you have two spirits in your body or anything like that. It's more of a metaphoric term that links us to a material world to a spiritual realm. And all of that obviously is connected to land and to water. So in different First Nations across North America, there's a long history of gender variance, as there is in every Indigenous culture around the world. As far as I know, I haven't heard of one yet that hasn't had that. If any of you know of one, I'd be interested to know. So that's kind of how the term Two-Spirit came about. But there has been something that unites all of us, well, a few things, but one is our colonial history. And you've all heard this term faggot, I'm sure. For those of us in North America, there's kind of a unique link to history. Faggot is a bundle of sticks that you use to start a fire. And De Las Casas was a priest that traveled with Columbus on his voyages and ended up not traveling with him anymore because he just couldn't handle the atrocities. But one of the things that he documented in his journals was how confused and upset not just Columbus, but other explorers were when they came across people that didn't fit neatly into a gender binary. And so one of the practices was to bundle them up like a faggot, like a bundle of sticks, and burn them. And often they would burn 13 to stand for Jesus and the 12 apostles. So this is the imposition of homophobia, genocide, and epistemicide, the killing of our knowledge systems that started 500 and some years ago. So you can see how people would very quickly distance themselves from any kind of, gender variant behavior or actions or expression. And depending on which community you come from, that traditional history or that ancient history around gender variation and sexual variation, sexual diversity, can either become hidden or go underground. So in Canada, there have been governmental policies and actions that have threatened the integrity of First Nations, our families, our relationships, and other loving partnerships in our communities and in our nations. And aggressive assimilation policies have attempted to displace our own understandings, practices, and teachings around sexuality, gender, and positive relationships and replaced with Judeo-Christian. So one of the main documents in Canada that regulates Indigenous people's bodies is the Indian Act. So anybody who's First Nations and registered as an Indian, every aspect of our lives is kind of detailed in this act. There's been different amendments to it, but right down to how many chickens you can have, for example. So some of those have changed, but they're very definitely regulating sexuality for one. It's because homosexuality is not acknowledged. Any kind of non-heterosexual relationship is not acknowledged. And even women weren't acknowledged initially because they weren't seen as human. So the residential boarding school era also is something that had a really significant impact. So that lasted for over 100 years in Canada. The last residential school closed in 1996. So this is fairly recent and it lasted a long time. Over 150,000 children were forcibly removed from their homes and sent to the residential schools. So similar to some of the things that have happened in Australia and other nations, with the idea that kids would go in and become Christianized or more European. And that was in line with the governmental policy, assimilation policy at the time. So one of the first things that happened at the residential school is that bodies were regulated. So hair was cut. Girls were forced to wear dresses, a certain kind of dress at a certain length. So because this started in the Victorian era, any part of the body wasn't supposed to show. Even the leg of a chair was seen as too enticing. And they were separated by perceived gender. So girls were put in one part of the school, boys were put in another part, or they were separated completely by town or city. And so you can see after 100 years of that, even people who are professed to be traditional, you can't help but internalize those policies or those actions. So religious perspectives and actions had a huge impact on our communities and the understanding of sexual diversity and of gender diversity. And of course, fundamentalism is a big part of that. It's not even fundamentalism, it's like, it's just pervasive, I would say. And even within our own communities, when there's kind of a resurgence now of revitalizing language, culture, and spiritual practices, there's a right-wing swing. So that, I guess because when people lose something, you try to hang on to what you can, but sometimes what they're hanging on to is the most oppressive. And so there's a lot of examples of that in schools in Canada, in ceremonial practices at the school, where in the past our ceremonies weren't divided by gender. But now when we do a smudge, which is like a purification ceremony with kind of grass or a plant or a medicine that we light, Now they're putting girls on one side and boys on the other side of the room, when that never ever happened before. And so the impact on girls and the impact on trans-identified and the impact on queer students is different than the impact on boys. So in ways, the boys are benefiting from the imposition of a patriarchal culture in terms of male privilege. So how does this impact, what are the impacts on queer youth? Well, one of the things that I didn't mention earlier was that one of the reasons why I wanted to submit a proposal to come to the Indigenous Peoples Conference in Education is when I was doing my undergrad at Sac State, I helped out with a queer youth group. And because I had to go home after the school year, I would go home and then come back in the fall. When I came back in the fall of my last semester, I went back to the youth group and I noticed that none of the Native American kids were there. And I asked, I said, what happened to TJ and what happened to so-and-so? And it so happened that all of them had committed suicide over the course of the summer. And it was traumatic and devastating for myself and also obviously for the youth. But it made me wonder, what was it about my own experiences that made me an empowered person around my own sexuality and gender, and what made it so that those ones didn't want to live. And so that became kind of a quest to try and find out why. And LGBT Aboriginal youth suicide rates are 10 times higher, this is in Canada, than any other group. Two-spirit identified male suicide, 21% have attempted suicide. For girls, 39% have attempted suicide. And for transgendered identified youth, 56% have attempted suicide. So these are really profound statistics when you think about it. And right now we're doing a homelessness study on Two-Spirit people and homelessness in urban centers, and we're finding that the homelessness rates are really high as well. So the combination of anti-trans with structural and individual racism results in devastating levels of discrimination. So extreme poverty, high HIV rates, and obviously high suicide rates. We're finding that Two-Spirit youth are dropping out or being forced out of school at a very young age. And for trans-identified youth, some of them are dropping out of school as early as 3rd grade. So if you can imagine that, if any of you have kids or nieces and nephews or, siblings, what would make a 3rd grader feel so unsafe in a school that that they would drop out or they would want to commit suicide? So I think it's important to know these statistics, and I know in your presentation, you said that they aren't really there yet for Australia. They aren't really there yet for Canada either. So it is really important that we continue to do research in this area in all aspects of it, quantitative and qualitative work. The EGAL School Climate Survey found that 70% of LGBT youth of color experience harassment at school, verbal harassment, physical, but also sexual harassment. And over 10% hear homophobic remarks just from their teachers. This is Bella. She was a student in Winnipeg, and there's been discussion around having bathroom choices, and that's just kind of a fundamental human right that we all should be able to use the bathroom, right? And for Bella, she was using the girls' bathroom, and one of the parents complained about it, and what happened is she ended up having to leave the school division and now is in another city. So that's her hashtag Pink for Bella. If any of you are on Twitter, you could send her an encouraging message. And, you know, she's a very empowered young person, but I think right now it's her parents that are having the hardest time because they're bearing the brunt, psychological brunt of what's happened with their daughter. So coming into this research, you know, I gave you some of my personal background and how it came, why I was interested in doing this research. But I started to wonder, well, what does the term two-spirited really mean? Because like all terms in the English language, there's room for shifting, and I think that the term has changed a bit in meaning. And I've also heard some really odd kind of traditional teachings about what two-spirited means, and we know that people just made up those teachings. I guess all teachings are made up. Some were just made up thousands of years ago, others just yesterday, I suppose. And then how can or does the empowered identity of a two-spirit person appear given the context or the reality of sustained homophobia, sexism, and racism? So success in part would depend on how the answers are sought. So like in any research, the way that you frame your question and the way that you go about your methodology shapes, you know, your responses and how you address it. So because the answers could only come from the two-spirit community, it had to be conducted in ways that were congruous with knowledge, experience, values, and ethics of two-spirit people. So using an Indigenous methodology. I know that some of you have used Indigenous methodologies. It's no longer kind of an emergent paradigm. Now it's a valid paradigm within most academic institutions. Indigenous methodologies are as old as our ceremonies and our nations. They are with us and always have been with us. Our Indigenous cultures are rich with ways of gathering, discovering, and uncovering knowledge. They are as near as our dreams and as close as our relationships. So thinking back to that painting that I started with, one of the features of that painting was that everything is connected, so that our understanding on our language is relational. And with relationality comes relational accountability. So what are some of the features of an Indigenous paradigm? And this is from Sean Wilson's book. And Sean is my younger brother. He actually teaches at the Northern Rivers campus in Lismore. And so some of the things that he talks about, and others as well, is that you have to be prepared in order to go into this journey of research. That it's a process, and our ancestors and community will tell us when it's right and when it's not right, and that ultimately knowledge is communal, that we don't own it, that it belongs to all of us. And again, relational accountability to all our relations is important. So it's not just relationships with each other as individuals, but also our relationship and accountability to the water, to the land, to our ancestors, and also our relationships to concepts, theories, and thought. And then reciprocity obviously is key and important in, I would say, almost every Indigenous community that I've heard of anyway, that you don't just take, that there's a reciprocal relationship. And all of this framed within a holistic worldview. So some of this, I'll just kind of skim through some of this, but I was interested to find out that the term two-spirit was actually used as early as the 1940s and 1950s, 1960s, but it didn't refer to anything to do with queer people. It referred to people that were biracial. And so the context that I use the term two-spirit, and I think most of my colleagues as well, that we use it, we're not talking, maybe people are biracial, but that's not what the term refers to. But just to make it clear that term, English term, was used before. But in the literature, there's psychological and educational literature on identity development that talked about coming out, talked about identity theory of queer people, but there was nothing that really talked about identity and Native queer people. There was a lot of anthropological writings, especially between 1800 and the 1950s and 60s, that looked at gender variance. And one of the interesting things about that was that mostly it was white anthropologists going in and looking at gay males, funny enough. And some of them writing some pretty offensive things. Some have actually later been charged with exploiting people in the community. So the term berdache is something that came up, and berdache is a French term, but it came originally from the Persian language, which was a genre of poetry that older men wrote to younger boys. So it was kind of a love poetry. But over the centuries, the term came to mean sodomite, so it took on a negative connotation. And the only other literature that was available at the time was poetry and prose written by self-identified Two-Spirit people. So the anthropological writings, and I'm sure this is probably similar to anthropologists who write about or wrote about the First Peoples of Australia, typically convey the Christian assumption that homosexuality is wrong, and they're heavily vested in a binary male-female gender construction. And there was an exoticized and romanticized writing about First Nations. There's many examples of that where people who were studying First Nations, even photographers or artists, would take a bundle of headdresses, for example, and get their people to wear them and take a photo or draw a picture. So their representation was very much through their own lens and understanding of what they wanted us as Native people to be. This is a painting by George Catlin, and he was one of the people that was notorious for having this bag of clothes. And so you see that clothing is very gendered, as Sandy was talking about in her presentation, gender expression in clothing, particularly in the Plains cultures, and now has been internalized, and people very much identify their Native heritage around the clothing that they wear in terms of what they wear to ceremony or traditions, when in fact that may not have been the traditional clothing at all. An example of that is in my own community, where men and women or anybody in our community, we wore the same clothes. We wore the same type of clothes, and mostly it was for utility because it gets to about minus 40 something in the winter. So your primary interest is to keep warm. In the summer, your primary interest is to be mobile, but also keep the bugs off of you. But now today, within traditional circles, some people say that women have to wear long skirts past the ankle. So you can see kind of that Victorian narrative coming into the picture. So there are our contemporary definition of Two-Spirit, and this is from Two-Spirit People by Jacobs, Thomas, and Lang. And so their definition was kind of an umbrella definition. And you can see how language has changed a little bit since they posed this definition, but generally they say that Aboriginal people who are gay or lesbian, contemporary Aboriginal gender categories, traditions wherein multiple gender categories and sexualities are institutionalized. So in some First Nations languages, there are specific gender categories, like more than one or two or three or four, as opposed to Cree, where there's a gender continuum. And I should also add, in Cree, in Swampy Cree, we don't have a word for queer, or we don't have a word for homosexuality, because it is seen as part of the normal. So it links back again to what you were talking about earlier, that it's not a subculture, it's just part of normal human behavior. And there were same-sex couples that married or had unions. So the Two-Spirit movement that probably all of you have heard of, the term in its current form came about in the 1990s in Winnipeg. And it was at a gathering at the Manitoba Legislative Building around land and Indigenous sovereignty rights that a woman had a dream or a vision, and in that dream she, the term Twospirit came to her. So the term, people started using that term. They had a ceremony for the naming, like a naming ceremony, and that's when people started using it. In 1993, the American Anthropological Association made a statement, and they asked that all academics stop using the term Berdache and start using the term Twospirit instead. And I think that in recent publications, especially in Canada, it's very common that you see the term Twospirit used in schools and in governmental documents. So one of the things that came out of the research that I've been doing is the term coming in. And so we're using the term coming in, not instead of, but also in addition to coming out. So coming in was a process, or is a process, a communal process, but also an individual process. And for people that took part in the study that were Cree and Ojibwe from Manitoba and Saskatchewan, all of them talked about having established positive familial and communal relationships when they were very young in their home community, either with their nuclear family or with extended family or friends. And then at some point, they all described a process of fragmentation whereby they had to hide one part of who they were, and that one part was the queer part. And then people talked about coming to a point where they had to make a choice or a decision to kind of cut loose from their family or from their community or from parts of their community in order to kind of be who they were. And for many of the people, as probably is similar in other communities, the idea was to go to the next biggest community. And in Canada, it would be like Saskatoon, Winnipeg, Vancouver, and all of those cities have very large Two-Spirit populations. San Francisco is another big place for Two-Spirit people. We all thought this would be the gay mecca and the answer to our problems, but unfortunately, for those of us who are First Nations, finding out where we belong and where we don't belong is part of the process, because there is a lot of racism, misogyny, and classism within the mainstream queer movement and communities. And so the term coming in is coming into community either by creating it yourself, coming into your own identity, and then disciplining theory and practice. I'll save that for another lecture. So LGBT First Nations people's identities represent an interconnection of spirituality, sexuality, culture, gender, and land. Empowered and resilient identities were formed in response to and in the face of overwhelmingly harmful governmental policies. And individuals and groups alike followed a process of coming in to empowerment. Institutional forms of racism, sexism, classism, and homophobia interconnect, obviously, and religious attitudes are a major source of prejudice, according to the Human Rights Commission. So what does all this mean? Double rainbow? It means that change can be on an individual level, obviously, or it can also be systemic. So there was a little Valentine's out the other day. It said, "I tolerate you." That was very funny. But, you know, there's this whole education movement teaching tolerance, and I think I can barely tolerate that myself because it's one step away from hatred, right? So we're on this continuum, and hatred and ignorance are on that same side. And obviously we're all here, so we're hopefully all on this other end where, you know, it's not just enough to be aware. You have to take action. You have to advocate on that. So for those of you that aren't queer, it's using your heterosexual privilege. For those of you that are male, it's using your male privilege. For those of us that are cisgendered, using our cisgendered privilege to advocate and to take action. And, you know, thinking back to the suicide rates, there's one thing that can prevent a suicide rate, and that's a healthy, positive relationship with one person, right? So for all of those people that committed suicide or attempted suicide, they didn't have one person in their life that they felt like they could be 100% themselves with at that time. And so for all of us in this room, I think that's really important, because we're all that one person. And for some of you, you may be that one person for 10 people or 20, or, you know, if you're an educator, that may be thousands of people. So it's really important to be on the other end. And if a belief system is something that's stopping you from allowing someone to use the washroom, then go and be an accountant or something, I don't know. So do something else, I don't know what it would be. But so obviously this is all part of transformation, and so I added this after Andrew's presentation, that transformation rather than integration, right? So we're all here because we want to resist colonial ideologies about sexuality, gender, and legal rights. Resist the hierarchical, oppressive colonial laws by linking back to our own laws, but not just linking back to them, being able to look at them from a lens that allows for, validates, acknowledges sexual diversity and gender diversity. It's okay to question. It's okay, you know, our traditions change, has been said earlier. All traditions change, but who decides how they change? So, you know, and hopefully they change in a way that's inclusive rather than oppressive. Addressing homophobia and transphobia in our own communities is critical. So even by using the term gender roles, we're enforcing a binary. Because a role, when you say role, it implies somebody's acting. And who are the ones that are acting? Usually they're the ones that are being marginalized most, right? So I try to use the term gender importance or other ways to signify people's importance within a continuum. Each nation and each individual has a right to be sovereign, so the notion of body sovereignty is really critical. And body sovereignty, if you can't be sovereign in your own body, then how can we be sovereign or self-determined as Indigenous nations? It's a critical and essential part of nationhood. And gender self-determination, that just seems so basic, that people be allowed to and encouraged to identify in whatever gender they feel. It's just so simple, but yet so entrenched, right? So all of these are principles and part of the movement Idle No More. And Idle No More started in Saskatchewan. There was 4 women that started liking each other's posts on Facebook. And they said, well, you know, there's these new laws that are pending in Canada, one 400 and some pages long, that kind of smashed a whole bunch of laws into one, an omnibus law. And people came together and said, no, enough is enough. We're going to address the continual denigration and degradation of Indigenous sovereignty and the denigration or the way that environmental protection has been changed and the way that water and the land is protected has changed. So that's how the Idle No More movement started. From the beginning, it was an inclusive movement. 3 of the women were First Nations, 1 was non-First Nations. And now it's gone from 4 people to hundreds of thousands around the world. So I'm really happy to be a part of that movement. And if any of you want more information, please come and talk to me after. You can check out the website. And social media is a really useful tool for the movement. What's happened now is that there are over 700 groups around the world that are doing Idle No More interventions or actions. It's an educational movement, and I would say that people are looking at their local issues and then uniting with other groups to get support on how to address issues in their community. So some good news, just some examples in Canada. University of Saskatchewan just passed in our anti-discrimination policy, we added the terms gender identity, gender expression, and two-spirit identity, which means that you cannot discriminate against people because of what they wear. And this includes in ceremony on campus. So you can see that that stirs up a little bit of discussion within some of the circles on campus. And there's, along with that has been efforts to educate some of our elders about what sexual diversity is and what gender diversity is, because even though they may speak the language and know the ceremonies, and they may not know the ones around inclusivity, for example. We have queer sweat lodge and queer pipe ceremonies. And then we have the rainbow flag that's brought in at the grand entry at our powwow. Red River Community College in Winnipeg has changed their application form to be more inclusive in the categories that they have when people apply. And these are just some photos from local. This is a Gay Straight Alliance at a First Nations high school. That's the rainbow flag being brought in at the powwow. And this is a two-spirit drum. So we built a drum about 11 years ago or 12 years ago. And it's brought out at different events. And so we like to use that term coming in or coming into the circle. And even now, I noticed that someone has created a coming in ceremony. And so in Cree culture, we had what was called a walking in ceremony for little kids. It's kind of an acknowledgement of the part of the community, public acknowledgement. And so now people have created a coming in ceremony for queer people to acknowledge that they're central and part of a community, especially those that have been disconnected for whatever reason. And just a reminder that there are no closets in a teepee. So the power within, I think, is a really great way to start, because all of these answers are within ourselves and within our own communities. The stories are there, but it's up to us to interpret them in a loving and caring way. So Kinanaskmit now, which means thanks to each and every one of you. And if there's any questions after, I think we'll have a Q&A period.